Hello, everyone. Welcome to our lesson two of our subject Understanding the Self, still in collaboration with G Class 101. Thinkers just eventually got tired of focusing on the long standing debate since 6th century BC between the relationship of these two components of the human person. And whatever relationship that these two have is less important than the fact that there is a self. The debate shifted into another locus of discussion. Given their new ways of knowing and the growth of the social sciences, it became possible for new approaches to the examination of the self to come to the fore. One of the loci, if not the most important axis of analysis, is the relationship between the self and the external world. What is the relationship between external reality and the self? In the famous story Tarzan, a little boy named Tarzan was left in the middle of the forest. Growing up, he never had an interaction with any other human being but the apes and other animals. Tarzan grew up acting strangely like apes and unlike human persons. Tarzan became an animal in effect. His sole interaction with them made him just like one of them. Disappointedly, human persons will not develop as human persons without intervention. This story, which was supposed to be based on real life, challenges the long standing notion of human persons being special and being a particular kind of being in the spectrum of living entities. After all, ourselves are not special because of the soul infused to us. We may be gifted with intellect and the capacity to rationalize things, but at the end of the day, our growth and development and consequentially ourselves are truly products of our interaction with external reality. How much of you are essential? How much of you who are now a product of your society, community, and family? Has your choice of school affected yourself now? Have you been born into a different family and schooled in a different college? How much of you are now would change? So today we're going to talk about the self, society, and culture. What is the self? The self, in contemporary literature and even common sense, is commonly defined by the following characteristics. We have separate, self contained, independent, consistent, unitary, and private. This is according to Stevens, year 1996. By separate, it means that the self is distinct from other selves, which means the self is always unique and has its own identity. One cannot be another person. Even twins are distinct from each other. Second, self is also contained and independent because in itself it can exist. Its distinctness allows it to be self contained with its own thoughts, characteristics, and volition. It does not require other self for it to exist. It is consistent because it has a personality that is enduring and therefore can be expected to persist for quite some time. Its consistency allows it to be studied, described, and measured. Consistency also means that a particular self traits, characteristics, tendencies, and potentialities are more or less the same. Next, we have unitary. Unitary means that the self is the center of all the experiences and thoughts that run through a certain person. Self is like the chief command post in an individual where all processes, emotions, and thoughts converge. Finally, self is private. Each person sorts out information, feelings, and emotions and thought processes within the self. This whole process is never accessible to anyone but the self. This last characteristic of the self, being private, suggests that the self is so isolated from the external world. However, we also see that this potential clash between the self and the external reality is the reason for the self to have a clear understanding of what might it be, what it can be, and what it will be. From this perspective, then, one can see that the self is always at the mercy of external circumstances that bump and collide with it. It is ever changing and dynamic, allowing external influences to take part in its shaping. The concern then of this lesson is in understanding the vibrant relationship between the self and external reality. This perspective is known as the social constructionist perspective. Social constructionists argue for a merged view of the person and their social context, where the boundaries of one cannot easily be separated from the boundaries of other. Social constructivists argue that the self should not be seen as a static entity that stays constant through and through. Rather, the self has to be something that is unceasing flux in a constant struggle with external reality and is malleable in its dealings with society. The self is always in participation with the social life and its identity, subjected to the influences here and there. Having these perspectives considered should draw one into concluding that the self is truly multifaceted. Consider a boy named Natoy. Natoy is a math professor at a Catholic university for more than a decade. Natoy has a beautiful wife whom he met in college, Nita. Nita was Natoy's first and last girlfriend. Apart from being a husband, Natoy is also blessed with two doting kids, a son and a daughter. He also sometimes served in the church too as a lector and a commentator. As a man of different roles, one can expect Natoy to change and adjust his behaviors, ways, and even language depending on his social situation. When Natoy is in the university, he conducts himself in a manner that befits his title as a professor. As a husband, Natoy can be intimate and touchy, where Nita considers him sweet, something that his students will never conceive him to be. Natoy, as a father, can be stern. His kids fear him. As a lecturer and commentator, on the other hand, his church mates knew him as a guy who is calm, all smiles, and always ready to lend a helping hand to anyone in need. This short story is not new to most of us. We ourselves play different roles, act in different ways depending on our circumstances. Are we being hypocritical in doing so? Are we even conscious of our shifting selves? According to what we have so far, this is not only normal, but it is also acceptable and expected. The self is capable of morphing and fitting itself into any circumstances it finds itself in. Remaining the person and turning chameleon by adapting to one's context seems paradoxical. However, according to our French anthropologist Marcel Mao, he has an explanation for this phenomenon. According to him, every self has two faces, the personae and the moi. Moi refers to the person's sense of who he is, his body and his basic identity, his biological givenness. Moi is a person's basic identity. Personae is composed of social concepts of what it means to be who he is. Okay? Personae has much to do with what it means to live in a particular situation, a particular family, a particular religion, a particular nationality, and how to behave given expectations and influences from others. In the story above, Natoy might have amoy, certainly. He has to shift personae from time to time to adapt to his social situation. He knows who he is, and more or less, he is confident that he has a unified, coherent self. However, at some point, he has to sport his stern professional look. Another day, he has to be the doting but strict father that he is. Inside the bedroom, he can play goofy with his wife, Nita. In all of this and more, Natoy retains who he is. He's being Natoy. He's Moy, that part of him that is stable and static all throughout. These dynamics and capacity for different personae can be illustrated better cross-culturally. Example, for example, an overseas Filipino worker adjusting to life in another country is a very good case study. In the Philippines, many people unabashedly violate jaywalking rules. A common Filipino treats road, even national ones, as a basically his, and so he is just merely crosses whenever and wherever. When the same Filipino visits another country with strict traffic rules, say Singapore, you will notice how suddenly law abiding the said Filipino becomes. A lot of Filipinos has anecdotally confirmed this observation. The same malleability can be seen in how some men easily transform into sweet, docile guys when trying to woo and court a particular woman and suddenly just change rapidly after hearing a sweet yes. This cannot be considered a conscious change on the part of the guy or the part of the law abiding Filipino in the first example. The self simply morphed according to the circumstances and context. In the Philippines, Filipinos tend to consider their territory as part of who they are. This includes considering their immediate surrounding, thus perennial, or meron tayong tinatawag na tapat ko, linis ko. Then, Filipinos most probably do not consider national roads as something external to who they are. It is part of them and they are part of it. Thus, crossing the road whenever and wherever becomes a no-brainer. In another country, however, the Filipino recognizes that he is in a foreign territory where nothing technically belongs to him. He has to follow the rules or else he will be apprehended. Language is another interesting aspect of the social constructivism. The Filipino language is incredibly interesting to talk about. The way by which we articulate our love is denoted by the phrase mahal kita. This, of course, is the Filipino translation of I love you. The Filipino brand of this articulation of love, unlike English, does not specify the subject and the object of love. There is no specification of who loves and who is loved. There is simply a word for love, mahal, and the pronoun kita, which is a second person pronoun that refers to the speaker and the one being talked to. In the Filipino language, unlike in English, there is no distinction between the lover and the beloved. They are one. So when I say mahal kita, it doesn't mean that the one I love is a man or a woman. Yan. Interesting too is the word mahal. In Filipino, the word can mean both love and expensive. In our language, love is intimately bound with value, with being expensive, being precious. Something expensive is valuable. Someone whom we love is valuable to us. The Sanskrit origin of the word love is lab, which means desire. Technically, love is a desire. The Filipino word for it has another intonation apart from mere desire or valuable. Another interesting facet of our language is its being gender neutral. Now, this is what I told you a while ago. In English or Spanish and other languages, the distinction is clear between a third person, male, and third person, female pronoun. He and she, él and ella in Spanish. In Filipino, it is just plain siya. Now, there is no specification of gender. That is why we called it gender neutral. Our language does not specify between male and female. We both call it siya, whether we are referring to male or a female or a gay or a bisexual. It's gender neutral. In these varied examples, we have seen how language has something to do with culture. It is a salient part of culture and intimately has a tremendous effect in our crafting of the self. This might also be one of the reasons why cultural divide spells out differences in how one regards oneself. In one research, it was found that North Americans are more likely to attribute being unique to themselves and claim that they are better than most people in doing what they love doing. Japanese people, on the other hand, have been seen to display a degree of modesty. If one finds himself born and reared in a particular culture, one definitely tries to fit in a particular mold. If a self born in a particular society or culture, the self will have to adjust according to its exposure. The self and development of the social world. Question is, how do people actively produce their social worlds? How do children growing up become social beings? How can a boy turn up to be just like an ape? How do twins coming out from the same mother turn out to be terribly different when given up for adoption? According to Mead and Vygotsky, the way the human person developed is with the use of language acquisition and interaction with others. They treat human mind as something that is made constituted through language as experienced in the external world and as encountered in dialogues with others. The way that we process information is normally a form of an internal dialogue in our head. Those who deliberate about moral dilemmas undergo this internal dialogue. Should I do this or that? But if I do this, it will be like this. Don't I want the other option? And so, cognitive and emotional development of a child is always a mimicry of how it is done in the social world, in the external reality where he is in. A young child internalizes values, norms, practices, and social beliefs, and more through exposure to these dialogues that will eventually become part of his individual world. Apart from the anthropological and psychological basis of the relationship between the self and the social world, the sociological likewise struggled to understand the real connection between the two concepts. In doing so, sociologists focus on the different institutions and powers at play in the society. Among these is the most prominent, now, which is the family. While every child is born with certain givenness, disposition coming from his parents, genes, and general condition of life, the impact of one's family is still deemed as a given in understanding self. The kind of family that we are born in, the resources available to us, human, spiritual, economic, and the kind development that we will have will certainly affect us as we go through life. As a matter of um, evolutionary fact, human persons are one of those beings whose importance of family cannot be denied. Human beings are born virtually helpless, and the dependence period of a human baby to its parents for nurturing is relatively longer than the most other animals. Learning, therefore, is critical in our capacity to actualize our potential of being humans. In trying to achieve the goal of becoming a fully realized human, A child enters a system of relationships, most important of which is the family. Another important aspect of the self is gender. Gender is one of the loci of the self that is subject to alteration, change, and development. We have seen in the past years how people fought hard for the right to express, validate, and assert their gender expression. Many conservatives may frown upon this and insist on the biological. However, from the point of view of the social sciences and the self, it is important to give one the leeway to find, express, and live his identity. These forms part of selfhood that one cannot just dismiss. One maneuvers into the society and identifies himself as who he is by also taking note of gender identities. A wonderful anecdote about Leo Tolstoy's wife that can solidify this point is narrated. According to the narration of Tolstoy, year 1975, Sonia Tolstoy, the wife of the famous Russian novelist Leo Tolstoy, wrote when he was 21, I am nothing but a miserable crushed worm, whom no one wants, whom no one loves, a useless creature with morning sickness and a big belly, two rotten teeth and a bad temper, a battered sense of dignity, and a love which nobody wants and which nearly drives me insane. A few years later, she wrote, it makes me laugh to read over this diary. It's so full of contradictions, and one would think that I was such an unhappy woman. Yet, is there a happier woman than I? This account illustrates that our gender partly determines how we see ourselves in the world. Oftentimes, societies forces a particular identity into us depending on our sex and our gender. In the Philippines, husbands, for the most part, are expected to provide for the family. The eldest man is in a family is expected to head the family and hold it in. Slight modifications have been on the way due to feminism and lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender, this LGBT activism, but for the most part, patriarchy has remained to be at work. So we Filipinos are patriarchal. The gender the gender itself is then shaped within a particular context of time and space. Nancy Chodoro, a feminist, argues that because mothers takes the role of taking care of the children, there is a tendency for girls to imitate the same and reproduce the same kind of mentality of women as care providers in the family. The way that the little girls are given dolls instead of guns or any other toys are or encouraged to play with makeshift kitchen also reinforces the notion of what roles they should take and the self they should develop. In boarding schools for girls, young women are encouraged to act like fine ladies, are trained to behave in a fashion that befits their status as women in society. The sense of self that is being taught makes sure that an individual fits in a particular environment. This is dangerous and detrimental in the goal of truly finding oneself, self determination, and growth of the self. Gender has to be personally discovered and assorted and not dictated by the culture and society. So take note if you are currently experiencing identity crisis, it is much better for you to express it now or never. No, um, there is nothing wrong in expressing ourselves of who we are and what we are. No, It's it's just a matter of acceptance for family, for the culture that you have, but there is nothing wrong with expressing one's identity, even if you are since we have the LGBTQA plus, no, we have this LGBTQ who will embrace other identities, and they are acknowledged and recognized already. So there's something nothing wrong in expressing yourselves in this modernized world. So thank you so much for listening for our second lesson and second lecture for understanding the self, society, and culture. And be ready for our short quiz, which will be posted in our Facebook group and in Schoology and in our LMS. Thank you so much, and God bless everyone.